welcome to the Production Talk podcast with me, Jan of mixartist.com.au. In this podcast series, we celebrate the modern way of producing music. We want to talk about all things related to songwriting, recording at home, and music production. So if you produce your music at home, this is the place to be. Please subscribe and recommend this podcast to all your friends. This is the Production Talk podcast, episode 22. Hello and welcome back to the next episode of the Production Talk podcast. It's amazing to have you on board again. Thank you for tuning in. I've had a busy week. I've completed an album lately, an additional single for another artist, and I've also been recently involved in the production of another podcast series where I just worked as a contractor for recording, editing, mixing, and this is also just gone live. So I've been really busy in the last couple of weeks, and I finally had a bit of downtime on the weekend. And in all honesty, I probably need another day or two because today is Monday. I'm recording my podcast, and I still feel a bit exhausted as things happen sometimes. And I'm sure that you know how that feels, and it happens to the best of us, I guess. So, but let me just steer back straight to the subject. Let's talk about music production, and a subject that we put on the back burner some time ago is mastering. We touched it every once in a while, but we've never gotten into more detail. So today I would like to take the opportunity to answer a question that was posted online a couple of weeks ago. And a friend of mine reached out and said, "Is mastering a scam? Why can't we just make it louder?" So that is an interesting question. And then I thought about it, and it's pretty obviously not a scam. I think we all know that. But then I thought about explaining why. And pretty quickly I realized that this is actually not simple to answer, and therefore it's actually not a simple question at all. It's actually a very complex question. And I'll try my very best today to answer this question as good as I can, and I'll remind myself not to venture off into too much technical detail. I hope you can forgive me if I do. So the first part, is mastering a scam? No, absolutely not. Mastering is an art form, also a highly technical job that has been around for many decades and has changed a lot over the decades. It's not snake oil. There is a lot of scientific and technical thinking to it, but in the end it all comes down to how it sounds and how we perceive things and how we feel things. And therefore I would say mastering is one of the most mysterious elements of music production. That's definitely true. At the same time, it's also the job that is reserved for the most skilled, most senior engineers. So if I had to draw a typical career of a mastering engineer, they often started as, let's say, as a recording engineer earlier on in their life. And it's not uncommon that they then had about 10 years of experience until they moved on to become only mixdown engineer and invested another 10 years into their career in this field, and eventually then sort of graduated into the mastering world. Mastering definitely is not the kind of job that engineers start directly from audio school or start their career that way. That's usually not the case because it just takes so much experience. So what I should really point out here is that the question as it was asked suggests that all mastering engineers do is make things louder. And that's definitely not the case. If it was that easy, then look, anybody could do it. But it definitely is not, because the way they make it louder is very well aligned with how musicians and listeners like music. And for that, there is no measurable scale for that. There's no button that you could press that would do this straight away. Effectively, what they do is they make it more likable, more lovable, and as a side effect, it also gets louder. So I would say that if you look at the most experienced engineers, mastering engineers, they often don't really approach a song with the attempt of, okay, now I dedicate time to make it louder. That's not really on their mind. They try to make it better. They try to make it more detailed, more musical. They look at the tonal balance. They look at making it sound as good as possible on as many different playback systems as possible so that it translates well from big speakers to PAs, to headphones, to laptop speakers, and that the essence of the song, the lovable elements, still come through. And I would say that as along the way, the loudness of the music will increase as well. But it's literally not as simple as turning a volume pot up, unfortunately, because we are basically at the edge of clipping with most music today. And if we just turn things up and things would start to clip, well, that's not what we want. That's definitely not the right thing to do, and that would make things a lot worse. So if the question is, can't we just turn it up and make it louder? Actually, in all honesty, often the answer is simply no, because technically we can't when mix files have maxed out the digital domain. Or the digital scale, I should say. And this is probably something that needs a bit more explaining. So in a previous episode, we already touched on bit depth and sample rate, but depth is what we really need to focus on here. So what that means is that the volume or amplitude of an audio signal, a mix or an individual recording, doesn't matter for in this context here, but they all have a finite number range to express the amplitude. And this number range is rather large. So if you recorded, let's say, something at 16-bit, you would have about 65,000 and a few volume steps to express how loud and quiet something gets. That sounds like a big number, but actually it's definitely needed. I would say that in some situations we need better than this, and that's why I also recommend to record in 24-bit. 24-bit would then allow for a resolution of about 16,777,000 and a few more individual volume steps, which is a ridiculously large number, and it sounds like that's absolutely unnecessary, but in all honesty, it actually is, and there is an audible difference by having that. So just to quickly shine some light on the math behind it, we talk about 24-bit. Each bit can have the position 1 or 0. And we have 24 of those, and that gives us a number range or a range of possibilities of 2 to the power of 24, and hence 60,777,000 and a few. Good. Okay, so now that we've spoken about this, basically what happens if you just turn things up is we reach the clipping point, and the clipping point is when we run out of numbers. In other words, the range from quiet to loud in our song literally has used up all of those 16 million resolution steps, and we try to make it louder and it has no more place to go. In other words, we've used up all the numbers, and the volume is, if you still try to increase the volume, it just doesn't get any louder. We reach the maximum, and for every sample it now repeats the same maximum, and that manifests itself in a click, or clip as we call it. So if you record your own music at home, I'm sure you know how it sounds. It has happened to everybody, I'm sure, that we just turned something up and it clipped, so we had to turn it back down. So nobody likes the sound of clipping, and that's the real problem here. Why can't they just make my master louder? That means that the peaks, the drum hits usually that stand out most, that consume most of the volume on your mix, that they already reach the maximum point pretty quickly. And from this moment on, you can't just turn it up anymore. Instead, you need to use other methods to change the perceived loudness. And that's a tricky thing. So a simple fader move upwards or a button that we could press that adds 6 dBs simply doesn't work anymore, because the side effects of that would be clipping. Let me just have some tea for a second. Excuse me. So what mastering engineers do is part of their art is apply dynamic range reduction or dynamic range compression. So dynamic range, just to clarify this for everybody, is the difference between loud and quiet. So if we think about orchestral music, for example, we can expect fairly significant dynamic ranges, because if an orchestra gets really loud, oh my God, it gets loud. However, if they get quiet, it gets also really quiet, which makes the dynamic impact. And that's why watching an orchestra live is quite a phenomenal experience. If we then think about other music, for example, let me just think about you use your keyboard to play some pad sounds. If you just play a couple of pad chords for a while, you've noticed that the volume of those usually just wavers around the same pocket and doesn't move much. We can also talk about music genres, let's say EDM or some metal genres that are basically with a very low, that have a very low dynamic range. Means there's very little difference between loud and quiet. In other words, literally everything is loud. But the problem with music is that if you make everything loud, well, it can get fatiguing to the ear. So to the listener, it might just, subconsciously make them turn it off after a while if it's just too much. And it also takes the interest away, because the problem is, if you've ever if you've ever read a text in full caps, that's a little bit annoying. This is actually not my analogy. I picked this up somewhere on the internet. But it's the same phenomenon. If everything is loud or in caps, eventually nothing has impact anymore because the contrast is no longer there. So from a mixing and also mastering perspective, and I would actually extend this and say even from a music production and songwriting angle, it is a good idea to consider those things and plan a song or arrange a song so that there is a certain room for impact. So if you start with the intro at full volume, you've got no more place to go. Nothing can be louder than that. So sometimes it's a wise idea to just turn it back down for a moment so that the next element can be more impactful. That's a very important songwriting technique and music production technique that carries itself on in mixing and mastering as well. And effectively in mastering, that's the last chance for anybody to, do something with this and improve it somehow. And that's when the final balance is basically laid. So what you basically do when you hire a mastering engineer is that you get the final quality control sorted. And ideally, you basically, hopefully you'll find a mastering engineer that you dearly trust. That should be somebody who's much more experienced than you. And what you will get is the certainty that somebody with a lot of experience and very, very high resolution speaker system looked over everything one more time and make sure everything is fine. It's the peace of mind that you get from mastering that this is now at the very best it can possibly be. That's basically the magic mastering engineers bring to the table. But I think I'd like to steer back one more time to the concept of dynamic range, because dynamic range is a funny thing where I basically would go as far as saying that every genre, and even within each genre, every song, may require their own dynamic range. And by dynamic range, let me go a bit more technical. I would say that's the difference between the peak of the signal, or the loudest transient, and the overall loudness of the song. That's often known as RMS, or also in more modern technical terms, LUFS. Those units measure the loudness of a signal. So just to demonstrate what can go on, imagine, for example, you record a snare drum. If you look at a snare drum channel and, just assume a normal backbeat performance, chances are that you would find, very loud snare hits. They sit usually up in the mix, so they're often fairly loud. However, the space in between is very quiet. So if we were to average this, average or root mean square, RMS, that's the same mathematical concept in simple terms. If you were to average this, the loudness wouldn't be actually very high because there's a lot of quiet area in between. So in order to make up, the snare needs to actually be louder on the onset when the snare drum or when the drumstick hits the skin. That's the attack of the snare, and that's also what we call a transient. So in order for drums to sound powerful and energetic, they need a bit of room above everything else for the short transients to stand out. And so therefore, if you think about a mix, for example, if you had really full-on synthesizers or distorted guitars, or let's say a woolly organ sound, all of those signals usually have a very high loudness, but very little peak value. So there's no transients involved. In other words, they don't need a headroom to make space for transients. So if those are mixed too loud to start with, then there's just not enough room for the transients to do what they need to do above. And you might hit the ceiling, the clipping point. And that's definitely not something we want to do. So what we generally do in recording, in music production, and also in mixing is to gain stage our signals sufficiently so that we have enough space for the transients to do what they just want to do. In other words, a mix should not be very loud yet, because the overall volume pocket is therefore a bit quieter compared to most masters, but there is definitely some transient motion above. There's headroom for the kicks and snares and percussions to do what they want to do best. Good. So I guess that also explains why when mixing, we should never focus on how loud it is compared to other things. A mix naturally sounds a little bit quieter because quieter in comparison to finished and produced and mastered music, I have to say. And that's because the music or the mix is probably still a bit more dynamic and needs more headroom for the transients. And that's where mastering engineers come in. And their job is to reduce the dynamic range very carefully and very skillfully while maintaining the integrity of the music. And the tools they use for that are commonly known as compressors, limiters, and probably a range of other tools as well, but those are the most common ones. They also use equalizers and saturation and things like this, but let's focus on tools that reduce dynamic range for now. So chances are, if you've ever started your own mix, you probably get a rough idea of what a compressor is. A compressor basically makes loud signals above a certain threshold quieter, thus reducing the dynamic range, the difference between loud and quiet, getting those things closer together. So here's the problem with compression. Compression is a tool just like, a chisel or a hammer or any other tool, and it's only as good as the craftsmanship behind it. So what I'm trying to say is it doesn't matter as much what you use, but instead how you use it and how carefully you listen when using that. And here's the problem with those compressors. They take an awful long time to really learn. So if I think about my own learning curve, starting in the late 90s, I learned the parameters quickly. That wasn't too hard to wrap my head around it. And I also started to use them in mixes. But if I listen to those mixes today, I have to admit that I didn't fully understand what I was doing. Nowadays, I see all the mistakes I did back then, where I, for example, had an attack time too short on a snare drum, and things that I would definitely do a lot more carefully these days. So I guess that's probably also my sense of taste. I have changed as a human being, so the way I perceive things and I want them to sound today is definitely different as well. But in all honesty, over the years of producing, I had several breakthroughs in my compression techniques where something really started to sink in and make deep sense, even years into my career. And it's now been about 20-something years for me, and I'm pretty sure that I still haven't learned everything there is to know about compression. And hopefully, I will still come across an epiphany here or there where I still learn some more about it. So it's actually an art form to use them very, very carefully and skillfully. And then we also need to look at the signal flow of a mix and distinguish at which stage we compress and limit. Because I would say that if you go to an individual source, let's say a shaker, a hi-hat, an 808, or a vocal, doesn't really matter. If you go to an individual signal and compress it, the potential for error or for damage, let me phrase it that way, potential for damage is, well, not quite as complex as further downstream. So compressing a kick drum or a bass is easier than to compress, let's say, a drum submix or an entire string section, or eventually a full mix. I would even go as far as going on the record here in stating that the more complex the signal you compress, the more delicate it becomes and the easier it is to make mistakes. So compressing a kick drum, no big deal. Most people would get this right. However, compressing an entire drum set as a submix is something that requires a lot more knowledge and skill, because there's also a lot more potential for the compressor to misbehave, and therefore takes more skill to get the signal through the compressor coming out the other end actually sounding better. And then if we go further downstream to the entire mix, to process an entire mix flawlessly and inaudibly, that takes some serious engineering and serious artistic skills to get that right. And the potential for error here is very high. I would say that when it comes to compressing or maybe limiting a mix in the mastering stage, I like to describe it as, there are probably 1,000 ways to do it, maybe more. And I guess 980 of them all sound bad. There's very few ways to do it actually better. And a mastering engineer is the person who has got the skill to do this very, very well and flawlessly without negative side effects. Because, well, hopefully without negative side effects. So if we take a mix that hasn't been compressed much at all, but is great sounding a mix, if you start compressing it for the first couple of dBs of compression, chances are it will get louder and as such more detailed and probably better in every regard. At the same time as you increase the compression, you also start to buy yourself some negative side effects. And I would say that for the first dB and a half of gain reduction, chances are the pros really outweigh the cons if done skillfully. But for every additional dB, the more you squash and compress your music together, the more potential there is for the compressors to also cause damage. And that takes a very skilled, very experienced engineer to navigate through without hitting, a wall of distortion on one end or pumping on the other end or so. There's always a lot of things that can go wrong that as an inexperienced user, we may not even be aware of, but mastering engineers definitely are, and experienced engineers definitely are. So it's a smart idea to trust those people with what they do. Good. I would also say that each song has its own loudness potential. By loudness, I refer again to the amount of compression applied and how loud the song eventually gets. And the sweet spot for each song may be a little bit different. So one song can handle a lot of compression or a bit of compression really well and sounds really nice, but the next song might be very difficult and might be very temperamental in responding to compression, and negative side effects may come up really quickly. And a mastering engineer will basically look at not just one song most of the time, but usually at an EP or album. A little note for all the listeners: if you want to release your music as an EP or album, give all the songs at the same time to the mastering engineer and let him know. You can't do this as individual singles and then expect that as at the end of it, they all sound like a finished album. Actually, that's one of the core workflows or core tasks of a mastering engineer, to take a collection of mixes that all sound slightly different and make them sound as if they belong together on the same album. The same tonal qualities, the same beauty, and nicely leveled against one another. So there's a lot of attention to detail that needs to be put in here. Good. Okay, so back to the actual question. Mastering is definitely not a scam. The art of mastering is several decades old. It started in the old days when mastering engineers were transfer engineers, and their sole job was to take a recording from, let's say, magnetic tape and get it onto vinyl, or even before that, wax cylinders and so on. So the transfer had to be made from one medium to another. While then later in about the 70s, that's when it actually started with processing, when mastering engineers started to, apply a bit of processes to make things sound actually better. So that's a fairly recent, well, not that recent, about 50-year-old development in the mastering history. But there was definitely a long time before where mastering engineers didn't do any of that. Good. Let's just keep talking about this for a moment. So when the CD came up, a lot of old vinyl records were transferred onto CD, hopefully from the original master tapes. Is always the better way than to stream it or grab it off a CD. And when these recordings were put onto a CD, things changed a little bit technically, because previously with tape and vinyl records, what set the limit for loudness on the medium was usually the chunky bit, the RMS, the loudness. The transients that stack out of it weren't usually a problem. There was enough space for that, and that just wasn't the limit, but it was just the over loudness that was the limit. When we moved into digital with CDs, it was the opposite. So CDs sounded equally good, so to speak, almost across the entire dynamic range until you hit the clipping point. And that's when it immediately turned sour and distorted. So when people first transferred their master tapes to a CD, they realized, okay, it's now nicely aligned. It comes out exactly as it went in. However, the transients actually didn't quite reach the absolute maximum. And that was a time when mastering engineers could literally just do one thing, bring up the fader and make it louder for a couple more dBs to chew up the remaining headroom. That basically was the best way of mastering a record, because it had literally absolutely no side effects, no compression involved, it just turned it up. But then we hit the clipping point. So we couldn't turn it up any further. There was a limit to it. And then as things progressed in the 80s and 90s, people then realized that they could actually get a little bit more volume out of it by just applying some processing and shaving off the transients. And that's when limiting came into play. This, unfortunately, set off a complete madness-feeding frenzy, which we today know as the Loudness War, and I often refer to those times as the dark ages of music production. And it all went around the following lines, that artists walked up to the mastering engineer and said, look, that band just released a record. It was really nice and loud. So can you make our records just as loud and just a little bit louder? Just a little bit. And so they did. And they became the loudest. So the next band listened to them and said, oh, whoa, they are loud. So can we also be that loud? And maybe just a bit louder? And that kicked off what we know as the Loudness Wars or Loudness Race. And I would say that the Loudness Wars definitely dominated the sound of the 90s, especially in the late 90s. The 2000s got really, really crazy. And in the early 2010s, the wave literally hit the pier. We hit a point where it couldn't get any louder anymore. It could only ever get more distorted, in all honesty. At that time, a lot of damage had been done by collective madness, I would say. However, ever since the early 2010s, there's been a lot of motion in the industry, a lot of movement for more dynamic range, to re-establish dynamic range. And what we've seen since is that this wave has hit the pier and it's now rolling backwards. So last week, I think, if you listened in, I had a lot of critical things to say about streaming services. Let me go on the record today with praising them for establishing loudness standards, because those loudness standards, as they are in place today and progressed over the last 10 years, were actually the tipping stone that made the wave roll back and that introduced more dynamic music back to the listener, which is a great thing for everybody because it just sounds so much better. So just to explain this loudness madness one more time. So there's a certain psychological phenomenon. If I play a piece of music to you and then play another copy of the same music to you again and ask you to pick the one you like better, chances are you would always pick the one that's louder. So all I need to do is just turn the same copy or a copy of a piece of music up by 1 dB. Even half a dB works reliably. And in a blind test, everybody will pick the louder one as the better one. This is not an effect that only works on members of the public, but it can also be reliably applied to professionals like myself. You could fool me the same way. Obviously, it doesn't make it sound any better just because it's louder, but it's just a certain perception that is built into our human brains. So as a general rule, as you produce, if you compare two pieces, two different guitar amps, two different microphones, whatever, two different synthesizers, never jump to conclusion until you first balance out volume differences. That way you make better decisions, actually based on sound quality, not loudness. So everybody is subject to this phenomenon that we always like the louder thing better. And so are record company owners and A&Rs and people like that. So it was assumed that in order to get a music deal, one would first have to impress the A&Rs. And the best way to do that is with just high loudness, so that once they turn a song on, it blows their socks off straight away. That is generally a good idea. However, if that's achieved by hyper-compressing music, it has so many negative side effects that this really outweighs any imaginary advantage one may have. So the idea is that apparently louder music sells better, and that has been proven wrong again, and again. Because what everybody here in the equation so far completely ignored is that you, as the listener at home, you've got a volume dial. Maybe the buttons on your iPhone, whatever this may be, but you can control volume. And if something comes on that you like and it's too quiet, chances are you're going to turn it up. And if something else comes on that is too loud and you don't like it, chances are you'll just naturally turn it down. So everybody who tortured music with hypercompression during the loudness wars always assumed that this volume increase now carries through to the listener. But they will just turn it down if they don't like it. So that's a bit of a conundrum, and I would say that large proportions of the music industry completely fell for collective madness here and chased an imaginary goal that actually didn't make much of a difference in real life. So if you want to impress an A&R, still blow their socks off with the first few chords, but don't do it by hyper-processing your music. Do it by playing your instruments ridiculously beautifully well. So if you start off very, very loud, at some stage, just let it go for a moment and let it build up again. So if music is always loud without any interruption, I personally find it very boring, and there's very few examples of songs that are constantly loud that I personally enjoy. Most of the music that I enjoy from almost any genre is music that has a bit of light and shade and loud and quiet. And, I call this the intensity curve. That's the journey that the music takes you on. And if that's only ever loud, I get bored of it pretty quickly. So be loud if you want to, but also be quiet. And it's the contrast that really makes all the difference. And if you write your music like this, it will also mix much better, and the master will come out really, really beautifully. At least that's my experience. So luckily, the loudness wars are over. Definitely they are. There are still some old blockheads in the industry who are somewhat stuck in the old way of thinking. But look, that's just human nature. There is no more advantage to be gained for making music particularly loud these days, because the way streaming services work is that they introduce loudness normalization. In other words, if we put two songs side by side, one with strong transients and more dynamic range, and therefore a quieter overall loudness, put right next to a song that has been hyper-processed and is really, really strongly compressed and limited, where there's very little movement between loud and quiet anymore. Now that we're in a world where most of the music comes from streaming services, they get control over this and they make it easier or make it better for the listener by balancing out volume differences. So the same two songs, the dynamic and the compressed one, put neck to neck on streaming services, would basically trigger the second song to be turned down, so that when you listen across both of them, the listening volume on your end is more consistent. And that means the louder song has been turned down, which now means there's several dBs, maybe 1 or 2, maybe 8, who knows? Hopefully not 8. But there's a couple of dBs of unused headroom now. And that's fine, because the advantage is that the listener, and that's you and I, everybody, now hear two different songs at about the same volume. And that is fantastic. I love that. So it basically means we are now liberated. We don't need to squash the music in mixing and mastering as much as we used to. We can allow for more dynamic range. And if we want to, if we, let's say, produce a black metal song or an EDM banger or something like this, we can aesthetically go for high compression rates, and that's perfectly fine. But just be aware it will be turned down. So if you do this, go for it. But do it for the right reasons. Don't do it to achieve loudness. Do it for tonal reasons. Make the music glue together better. And that's I believe how compression should be used these days. So loudness normalization has received a little bit of criticism in the past, especially from the people who became very good at hyper-compressing mixes and masters, overcooking them, in my opinion. Those were the people who were a little bit disgruntled, because now once the volume was turned down, well, the loudness advantage vanished, but all the negative side effects that came with hypercompression, they remain. They always remain. And that's a problem that I have with many, many masters and mixes coming out of the 2010s. There's exceptions, of course, but, Metallica have received some fame over their entire fan base, criticizing them for their sound based around too high a loudness. There's one example where it really backfired on them. So rest assured that today, all you need to do is to produce your music so that it sounds good and has a little bit of headroom. And if you give it to a good mastering engineer, they will sort it out from there and probably just do whatever is right by the piece of music, hopefully. And once it's then played back on streaming services, it will just integrate beautifully. I even find that songs that are produced more dynamically even perform better. They sound better after loudness normalization, while the hyper-compressed sausages, as some people call them, often start to sound a little bit weak, wimpy, and soft, or quite often distorted. So less pleasing. So the punchier songs are often the more dynamic ones, in my personal opinion. Good. I know that there's still a little bit of controversy about it, so some people may now strongly disagree. If you want to take this argument to my doorstep, you are absolutely welcome. I would love to talk to you about that in a nice manner, of course. You can find me on Facebook. It's the Production Talk podcast community. It's the official Facebook group. Please click there and I'll let you in, and then we have a discussion there. If you think that I missed something, if you think that there's something more to say, I would love to hear from you about the subject of mastering. So how do you find a good mastering engineer? What are the pros and cons here? How do you work out who to work with? So here's my idea. Instead of giving your album to one mastering engineer and hope for the best, because there are rotten apples around, like in any other industry, people who do not live up to their promises. Instead, look at the most influential records of your genre. Who are your heroes? Check their records and read the credits, and check out which mastering houses they were using. Why don't you reach out to those people and ask for a quote? And if you're not sure which way to go, another thing you can do is just decide for one song first and invest a little bit of money by giving the same song to, let's say, 2 or maybe even 3 different mastering engineers, and see what you get back. And then listen to them purely on an emotional level. meaning balance out any volume differences, put them into a blind test ideally so you don't know which one is playing, and just judge by your heart which song makes you happiest. And that's the mastering engineer for you, I reckon. But just before I finish, let me just add one last can of worms. It's the can of worms of automated mastering services. You may have heard that there's quite a few different services around that allow you to upload a mix and seconds later you get a master back. Let me be perfectly clear. This master has not been done by a human. Instead, it has been done by an algorithm. So it was uploaded, sort of scanned for, whatever content there may be, and then automatically something has been applied and is then returned to you. I definitely believe that the algorithms are getting better every day. And at some stage, this may lead to good sounding masters. So far, and I like to go on the record here, it's almost 2022. I have tried quite a few and not one of them was up to my expectations. Every single time I feel that I could do a better job mastering it, and I'm not even considering myself a mastering engineer. I call myself a mix engineer because mastering is not my day-to-day profession, but still I feel like I can outmaster every single one of them if I wanted to. So now think about what a specialized mastering engineer can do for your music. Somebody who does nothing else but mastering day in and day out, and who's very experienced. So, on this note, be careful with those automated mastering services. For a demo, it might be fine, but for a release, for an official release, just consider that whatever you release there is there to stay forever. And I've listened to a lot of music on streaming platforms where huge mistakes were made and in the production, mixing and mastering. And that's always sad because, that's now something that people have to live with forever, unless they, of course, pull it. But I think, if you release your music, put it in the right hands, find yourself a mastering engineer that you can trust, and then work with them. Good. Obviously, there's plenty more to say about mastering. I barely touched the surface. At some stage in the future, I hope to actually speak to a mastering engineer, a professional mastering engineer on this podcast. If that's something you'd like, please leave a comment. All of our episodes also have additional information in the show notes, like the link to the Facebook group, of course, and additional information on mastering, as well as a couple of mastering engineers that I have worked with and whom I recommend. It's all in the show notes, so just make sure at the end of the episode to just scroll down and have a quick look over there. Thank you for being on board today. I'll see you again for another episode of the Production Talk podcast next week. Take care, everybody. Have a great week. Bye for now.